Welcome back to Zooming In at the UnPopulist. I'm Landry Ayers. The MAGA movement was once an insurgency within the Republican Party. Now it is the party. But more than just a political takeover. This shift is the result of the consolidation of a movement defined by hostility towards its opponents and a vision of America based on a largely imagined past. Its intellectual and political leaders have a clear authoritarian blueprint for reshaping the country. In this episode, the UnPopulist's senior editor Berny Belvedere is joined by journalist Jason Wilson, who recently covered the 5th National Conservatism Conference for The Guardian. Through the lens of the conference, they map the entire MAGA ecosystem, from committed Trump loyalists to the ideologues pushing Christian nationalism and other anti-democratic visions.
National Conservatism Conference, NatCon 5, took place earlier this month. Jason, you had a really good write-up in The Guardian. What did this year's conference in particular suggest to you about where things stand with the movement?
The conference exemplified something you can see happening at pretty much any right-wing gathering in the United States. Increasingly naked expressions of nationalism, a really kind of open, sometimes even eliminationist hostility to these folks' perceived political enemies. Increasingly, you're hearing speeches that verge on white nationalism or head in that direction. There's an increasing assertion of white identity as the basis of American identity. And all of this is being attended by high-ranking members of the Trump administration. You know, in previous years, I think that NatCon and the Republican Party benefited from pretending that they were slightly different things, that they were at arm's length from one another. But the interesting thing about this year was it gives us a really good indication of where the conservative movement is now, where the Republican Party is now. It's an extremely ultranationalist party that seeks to resuscitate a largely imagined past on behalf of an American citizenry whose truest representatives are white people, and white men in particular.
In the beginning of Trump's ascent into politics, the burgeoning MAGA movement was a kind of insurgent force within it, and he little by little began taking over the party, and his hold on it became increasingly more complete over time. And now MAGA is the party. It's not just the intellectuals and the activists together, but there's also a significant representation from the government. I mean, we sometimes think of the MAGA movement as like a monolithic entity, and that can, of course, be fine when we're speaking very broadly, because there is a MAGA movement, one with shared goals and objectives, one that, as a kind of political organism, has had electoral success and has been massively consequential in recent American history. But to really understand it, we need to understand the various elements that make it up, because there are many different layers to it. One way to carve it all up is by role and function. MAGA's got this intellectual class, and they were present at the conference. And they also have a set of prominent influencers and public proponents. They were there as well. And also a number of political figures and elected officials who are committed to the cause. And that's not the only way to carve up the MAGA movement. In addition to that particular distinction, which again has to do with like area of focus and role within the broader movement, you can carve up the MAGA world as here are all the various groups who, despite having that core belief that liberals and leftists are pure evil, also have differing ideological emphases. Can you say a little bit more about the various sub-movements, about the variety of right-winger that you saw when you watched the conference?
The MAGA movement has completely displaced its internal opponents within the conservative movement, the Republican Party. I mean, that's all over. And it was all over, really, I think, by the time Trump was nominated, defeating DeSantis and Nikki Haley and what have you. I mean, that was really the last gasp of an older neoconservative, fusionist conservatism in the United States. That formation really has no real political power To the extent it does, actually, it is precisely to the extent that it's been wooed to some extent by the Democratic Party as a kind of centrism almost. But anyway, I mean, putting that aside, for a long time, I think the liberals and leftists have consoled themselves with the idea that once Trump goes, this will all be over, that there won't be a similarly charismatic figure for them to center their movement on, for them to rally around. That may or may not be true. Trump still, even to this day, is not an ideological creature. Yes, he's dismantling the Constitution. His gut instincts are anti-democratic, authoritarian, personalist, self-aggrandizing. But there are people in his movement who are ideologically and intellectually committed to anti-democratic, authoritarian, even eliminationist forms of government, or committed to carrying out eliminationist actions, authoritarian actions, and taking state power in order to do so. A lot of these folks have a lot of common ground, but there's definitely a more specifically Christian nationalist strand within the MAGA movement. The Christian nationalist strand within the MAGA movement, very fiercely patriarchal, fiercely anti-LGBTQ, and, theocratic. Douglas Wilson was there, who I've written a lot about in the past. He's a pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He's attracted a lot of coverage over the years for appearing to endorse slavery, for the way in which his church has dealt with sexual predators inside the church, for his conflicts with the local community. He kind of thinks that a democratic constitutional state that operates under laws that aren't biblical laws is kind of illegitimate. And so he's looking forward to a time when the United States, the world even, is governed in terms of biblical law. And his vision of biblical law includes, capital punishment for moral offenses. He's kind of a leading light for a lot of Christian nationalists, but he's just an example of that mindset. So that's definitely one strand within it. There's another slightly different strand, although still authoritarian, still patriarchal, still anti-LGBTQ, still characterizing political disagreement as a kind of a war where there's not room in the United States for these two irreconcilable ideologies, centered on the Claremont Institute, which has increasingly become important as a sort of intellectual reservoir for the Trump administration. It's generously funded by Tom Klingenstein, the single largest funder of the Claremont Institute and the chairman of their board. And they've produced, a lot of frankly authoritarian intellectual output during the Trump era, which has directly fed into political expressions of the MAGA movement. There's another strand who are more centered or aligned with the Trump family and the Trump inner circle who are there, whose ultimate loyalty is to Trump. I've been reporting on this stuff for a decade now, and I'm still kind of shocked every day at how large all of this has grown. So Christian nationalism isn't going to dry up and blow away when Trump's no longer around. The sort of American parafascism, whatever we want to call it, it's just got too much momentum now, too much institutional support, too much money, frankly, to just kind of blow away. I mean, why would it? There's no real opposition within conservative politics anymore to this authoritarianism and this sort of desire really to eliminate any political opposition. Trump's got the Congress in his back pocket. No one's winning primaries who isn't sort of signed up to some version of these kinds of ideals now. And so that's why CPAC and events like that are still sort of important and indicative of what's going on inside the conservative movement. But that kind of is becoming more and more central and more emblematic, really, of what right-wing politics in the US is right now. And for now, there may be disagreement on the margins, but really what you're seeing is a productive dialogue between people who don't maybe start in the same place, but they're all looking to take power together and eliminate the people who they see as their political opponents.
Let me stay on Douglas Wilson for a second. You mentioned that he has a congregation in Moscow, Idaho, and there's been a term within Christian discussion, the Moscow mood. It's been called confrontational and provocateur and even trolling as a way to sort of aggressively push back against what Christian nationalists and others within his movement see as the encroachments of liberalism. Did you get a sense from the conference that of all these different members of the Trump MAGA coalition, Christian nationalism has become the dominant one?
5 or 6 years ago, when I first started reporting on Douglas Wilson, he seemed like a much more marginal figure than he seems to be now, where he's really come into his own as a kind of North Star of Christian nationalism. And that's because he has been an exceptionally skilled institution builder. So he's got his congregation. He's also got a denomination, the Council of Reformed Evangelical Churches, and they've got congregations around the country who are bound together. He's also been instrumental in creating this institution of the classical Christian school. There are a lot of classical Christian schools that aren't affiliated with his denomination, but the ones affiliated with Wilson teach a theocratic, anti-secular kind of view of the world to these young people who then, many of them go to the university that Wilson established in Moscow, New St. Andrews College. New St. Andrews College has provided a lot of personnel to aligned companies, to think tanks in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, and to lower levels of the administration. I think the thing that people miss about Christian nationalism is that it's militantly anti-secular. It's militantly opposed to the idea that social and political institutions can somehow be neutral, right, or above or apart from religion. They really see secular institutions not as neutral, not as inclusive, not as a way in which we can negotiate differences in values, right? But they see them as really being dedicated to a false god, the false god of liberalism, of democracy, of feminism, of equalitarian movements. That is the spirit of the Moscow mood that I don't see discussed so often, because that's a kind of destructive impulse. It's not projecting some future where every Christian or perhaps even Abrahamic faith tradition are going to be reconciled and the just will be rewarded and the unjust will be punished. And in some versions, that can be a pretty harmless expectation. But in this case, it kind of warrants and demands the destruction of institutions that they see as idolatrous and demonic. I mean, I've written about a podcaster who's aligned with a church where Pete Hegseth goes, which is also in Doug Wilson's denomination. And folks in that church explicitly talk about secular institution, public school as being demonic. And so that's something that I think suffuses contemporary Christian nationalism, that kind of destructive impulse, the idea that the regime, the current institutional apparatus needs to be destroyed. And look around you, that's what's happening.
I think you're right to put your finger on this huge chasm between faith-based traditions that have an eschatology or a theology of the last days that is more on the harmless end of the spectrum, and ones that are quite apocalyptic and require, for their final realization, a purging of a lot of what we know of as modern society. So I'm a Christian, and like every other Christian, I have an eschatology or a theology of what will happen in the end. But I'm quite happy to say that the particular eschatology I subscribe to doesn't have as a theological prerequisite remaking America into a theocratic state. That's just it. The problem with Christian nationalism isn't so much the Christian qualifier, since there are many manifestations of Christianity that don't go the Wilson route, but the combination of the two words together, which seems to select for an aggressive and deeply illiberal public policy program and has society reshaping ambitions along authoritarian lines. On that note, I wanted to ask you about one particular speech from the conference that went semi-viral, the one given by Eric Schmidt, the U.S. Senator from Missouri. His speech attracted a ton of attention online, mainly from people rightly horrified at its patently illiberal vision for America. But it also elicited fist bump enthusiasm from the hard right online. What did you make of it?
I thought that Senator Schmidt's speech was a rhetorically skillful presentation of white nationalism, really. And that's kind of the transition we're seeing. If you want to really boil it down to what's happened in conservatism over the last decade, really, there's been a transition from a kind of civic nationalism, which excluded people who it sees as insufficiently patriotic, which has at times, at least implicitly, claimed that Christianity has something to do with being a good American and Islam maybe means you can't be a good American. But really, ultimately, agreed that, to put it very crudely and simplistically, if you say the Pledge of Allegiance and you mean it, and you've gone through all the right channels and done all the right paperwork, well, then anyone can kind of be an American, right? Now, look, I don't want to give a false impression of the past. American conservatives weren't always like that. They did go through a period of being pretty explicitly racist and anti-Semitic before the Second World War. But after the Second World War, there was a sense in which an explicitly racist politics was illegitimate, had been delegitimized by what we saw of National Socialism in Europe and the way in which it implemented racial policies. And conservatives were actually sensitive for a really long time of being accused of racism, right? And did sort of try to adhere to that view of civic nationalism, which is, America is an idea, and an idea that anyone can subscribe to. And we may have our differences about how much immigration should be allowed, but immigration is legitimate, and anyone who lawfully immigrates to the United States and is a loyal citizen is as American as anyone else. That's gone by the wayside, right? We've transitioned pretty much completely from civic nationalism to white nationalism. And Senator Schmidt's speech, and J.D. Vance made a very similar speech just a few weeks back, where it's setting up a number of tiers about who actually is a real American. And the realist Americans are those who can trace their ancestry to the colonial period. The earlier in the colonial period, the better. And amongst far-right groups, I've even seen tier lists of, it's better to have come over on the Mayflower or to have been in Jamestown than to have arrived in the early 19th century. There's a whole hierarchy they have of who's the realist. But the main point is that America is not an idea, right? It's a people, it's a nation, and that means white people, and white men in particular should be in charge. And especially anyone who's come, since the Hart-Celler Act, I guess, in the 60s, and the reforms of immigration law to make sure that it wasn't explicitly racist and no races were being explicitly excluded from immigration to the US. Anyone who's come since then is not as real an American as heritage Americans, they sometimes call them. That's how I saw the speech. Another thing I pointed out in the article is that Nate Hochman works for Senator Schmidt now, who was a rising star in the conservative movement, washed out at a time when his racist associations were still kind of a problem. He had done a Twitter space with Nick Fuentes, and that meant that he lost a prestigious journalism fellowship and left his job at National Review, went to work for the DeSantis campaign, got fired from the DeSantis campaign after circulating a video with neo-Nazi imagery in it. He then worked for a think tank established by Marco Rubio's former chief of staff, where he created and circulated videos with conspiracy theories. Some of them were implicitly anti-Semitic, certainly racist. And in fact, he went to Charleroi, Pennsylvania during the election to try and spread the eating dogs and cats narrative from Springfield, Ohio to Charleroi, Pennsylvania, where there's also been a lot of Haitian immigrants. And now he's working for Senator Schmidt. I wrote to them and said, hey, did he have a hand in writing the speech? They didn't write back, of course, but that was my thought. I mean, this is just trying to articulate a white nationalist politics in a way that is not so explicit that people who aren't clued into this sort of stuff will notice. And I've got no doubt that they would deny that that was the intention, but it seems to me that that's what was being said. And that is, again, emblematic of what's happening to the conservative movement, I think.
I remember Hochman. When the Springfield hoax about Haitians eating their neighbors' pets came out, and everyone understood fairly quickly that there weren't any instances of this happening, it would have been one thing to have wanted it to be true, but after realizing that it wasn't, to simply keep quiet about it. But Hochman was part of a group that didn't care that it was a hoax, because to them, the deeper narrative about immigrants being bad for America was true. And that justified running wild with absurdly false stories about immigrants doing heinous stuff. He actually tried to replicate the hoax in other cities. I watched a couple of videos of his in which he talked to people on the street and tried to paint a picture of a city in ruins because its water supply was being stretched due to immigrants. Immigrants were creating such a strain on resources, he argued in the video, that the only reasonable response was to get the immigrants out. And I just found that studied disregard for the truth emblematic of the right's new approach to politics. It used to be that this mixture of conspiratorial lunacy and unabashed vice signaling was cordoned off to the worst corners of the internet and kept there. They would bubble up sometimes, but there was more gatekeeping in the past. Hockman actually wrote a semi-viral thread on X exulting in the fact that now, on the right, there's this bottom-up phenomenon where instead of these unaccountably awful theories remaining in the dark corners of the internet where they were spawned, there's now a reliable pipeline and channel through which they reach the highest echelons of the right's public officials and government figures, culminating in Trump on the debate stage, sensationally regurgitating the Haitians eating pets hoax. So in Hockman's thread, he lists a bunch of examples of this new bottom-up information reality. But what's particularly striking to me is that instead of cataloging these instances and seeing them as examples of informational failure, he sees them as successes. This crowd, which has adopted a hard right populist frame for politics broadly, will argue that the examples show that now, finally, it's the people who are dictating what their leaders should focus on, rather than the leaders ignoring causes that this righteous Volk want highlighted and amplified. But again, to me, it's a horror story because what he's actually lauding is the right's informational failure on a deep structural level. He's exulting in the fact that the completely baseless panic about Haitians was picked up by and mass amplified by the now President of the United States. That's, of course, a marker of informational backwardsness, not one that bespeaks a healthy discourse culture for conservative activists and thinkers. It's an upside down information ecosystem. The tail is wagging the dog. The right wing discourse is dominated by unscrupulous, conspiratorial, inflammatory voices, and they pick up their signals from people even worse than they are. And then the movers and shakers tap into these growing narratives, and by then the narratives are running riot in our national discourse. So it doesn't surprise me at all to discover that Hockman is now part of Schmidt's policy team. Did the speech feel like an outlier relative to the rest of the conference? Or did you get the impression that its sentiment, its ethos, was in line with everything else that you saw?
The reason it got the applause that it did, and the reason that the conference promoted it, and the reason that it, as you said, went slightly viral is that I think it was right bang in the middle of, where the sentiments at the conference were. I don't think that there was anyone speaking up for civic nationalism. I think almost everyone there would agree that authentic, real Americans are white Americans, and ideally white Americans whose families arrived sometime in the 19th century, and the earlier the better, and that those who colonized the land, Vance said fought in the Civil War, right? He didn't say which side, but, those who participated in that era of American history are the real owners of the United States, right? And everyone else is impinging on their rights just by being here. I mean, I don't think that that's an exaggeration. I think that that's a fair paraphrase of what Senator Schmidt was saying, and I don't think anyone at the conference would disagree with that. I think that that is a prevailing opinion. Just harking back to what you said about Nate Hockman, I mean, what you're seeing there is an incentive structure, right? Like the material is coming from the bottom up, but, someone like him is responding to what he very clearly can see that, the upper echelons of the party want, especially in a campaign context. And to come at Senator Schmidt's speech in another way, there was a representative from Iowa by the name of Steve King, who is no longer in Congress. He had been ventilating white nationalist sentiments, but that was a different time, right? Like it was, Republicans saw it as a problem. But the substance of what he said is not very different from the substance of what Senator Schmidt said. And Senator Schmidt isn't seen as a problem. He's seen as a leader. So that's where they're at. It used to be that, as a reporter, if I unearthed some kind of racist thing that a congressional staffer or someone like that had said, that would be, embarrassing, a scandal. I still bring that stuff to light when I can, but Republicans don't care. At this point, they fully transitioned to an older form of right-wing politics, one that is more explicitly racist, white supremacist, and which regrets that white supremacy is less explicit and powerful than it used to be, in their view.
Let me ask about a couple of other figures from the government who were involved in the conference. Harmeet Dillon's the assistant AG for civil rights in Trump's DOJ. What was Harmeet Dillon's speech about?
Her speech was slightly less coherent than Senator Schmidt's. She was an RNC committee woman. She challenged Ronna McDaniel for the RNC chair, and that was a kind of a failed effort. But she made herself very useful to Donald Trump in his kind of wilderness years, acting as his lawyer in several actions. She ran a very ideological nonprofit that I did some reporting on called the Center for American Liberty. Their first big moment in the limelight was when they took on the case of a guy called Andy No, who's kind of a right-wing provocateur who got milkshaked and beaten up at a right-wing rally in Portland by some anti-fascists. And she took on that case and they tried to sue Rose City Antifa. But during COVID, she sued the government of California and Gavin Newsom personally over COVID restrictions, on churches and stuff like that. And then later on, they transitioned into suing school districts, healthcare providers on behalf of either parents of transgender children or on behalf of individuals who had gender transition to some extent and then had detransitioned and developed grievances about the way in which all that happened. So very culture war type stuff. She was a frequent guest on Tucker Carlson when he was on Fox. She actually acted on behalf of Tucker Carlson when he was threatening to take legal action against Fox. So anyway, she's been appointed as the Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights. And in Trump's first administration, yes, the Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights did some strange stuff. But I mean, she's really doing what Trump claimed that the Biden DOJ did, which is weaponizing prosecutions against political enemies of Trump. And the speech was just kind of advertising that and boasting about that and talking about, all the people who they prosecuted and who they're planning to prosecute, all the woke college administrators that she's planning to go after. And to me, it was just kind of like an effort at displaying her undying allegiance to President Trump. We were talking about the different kinds of NatCon people earlier. I mean, she's a good example of someone who is principally a Trump loyalist and something of a careerist. I mean, she ran actually for the California State House and I think once for Congress as well in the Bay Area, where she actually presented herself as something of a moderate, because you would if you were trying to get elected in the Bay Area. And during the War on Terror period, she did some legitimate civil rights work. She's a Sikh and she acted for Sikhs who had been discriminated against in various ways or subject to racist attacks even, because they happened to be wearing a turban at a time when Americans were confused about the difference between Sikhs and Muslims. At the Republican National Convention last year, she was a speaker and she actually led a Sikh prayer. It was quite a moment, and she was in her traditional dress and she offered a Sikh prayer on stage, and she was subject to all kinds of awful, horrible, racist abuse from right-wingers on X. So she cuts a slightly strange figure in the contemporary Republican Party, but because she's such a Trump loyalist, and that's really what she was trying to get across in the speech, how loyal she is to Trump and how effective she is as an instrument of vengeance for Trump and for his movement.
She is emblematic of this remarkable turn. Personnel hired to do jobs and to perform roles in the executive, seeing their jobs almost exclusively as serving the personal whim of this singular figure, the president. And so consider that her description of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, we are the president's shock troops. We are the front guard.
Right.
That's an absurd way to view your charge as the leader of a civil rights division. Instead of viewing the job based on what civil rights considerations would have before her, it's let you define what I should pursue, and then I'll turn this office into that. And I think that is microcosmic of the way that everyone else in the administration also views their role.
I think that's largely correct. In his first administration, Trump got frustrated because he thought the Attorney General to be his lawyer. That was his frustration in his first term, that the AGs he had were to some extent independent and did refuse to go along with some things. Even Bill Barr wasn't ultimately loyal enough in Trump's view. I think that there are others in the administration, I'm thinking of someone like Russell Vought, who's doing things actually that he's wanted to do for a while, since before Trump was around. Loyalty is a prerequisite, but I think with someone like Harmeet Dillon, all she's there to do is to sort of display loyalty, right? Russ Vought has displayed loyalty and now he gets to do what he wants. And I think that's a subtle difference. That's also something that you saw playing out at NatCon. There are committed ideologues.
Vought was there, right?
Yeah, he was. I know it's funny to say that, but I still don't really think Trump is ideological. I think his gut instincts are authoritarian and anti-democratic. But there are people who have a much better developed anti-democratic and authoritarian ideology, whether it comes from Christian nationalism or fascism is as good a word as any. And then there are just pure loyalists, and then there are people who've displayed enough loyalty or themselves see Trump as a sympathetic enough figure that they're prepared to sort of go along for the ride. I mean, we could talk about Yoram Hazony, who's the person who established the NatCon conference, who was also there, who's Israeli, which is kind of interesting, right? Because the right's attitude to Israel is kind of changing, I think. There's tension there. You saw Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz a few months ago having a bit of a set-to about Israel, to whom Cruz remains completely committed to the defense of Israel. And Carlson represents a more skeptical, America first kind of suspicion. Yoram Hazony, the founder of NatCon, is not an American nationalist. He's an Israeli nationalist who has lived in settlements, a very different sort of set of priorities than the kind of America first type nationalist that maybe Tucker or Nick Fuentes represents. But I think this kind of collection of people will kind of outlast Trump. It may or may not be popular in the absence of Trump. It may or may not command electoral majorities in the absence of Trump. But, it's a lot bigger than it was, and I just don't think it's going to disappear when Trump does.
Yeah, that's an excellent distinction that you made between figures within the administration whose first and really only function is to display loyalty and to take their cues from the whims of the president. And then there are these other figures who have a kind of antecedent politics or an independently formed social vision that they see Trump as a vehicle to begin to implement it and to begin to realize it. But they absolutely view the project as having a longer tail than Trump's own timeline. And I think the highest figure in the administration who can be characterized this way is J.D. Vance, who you can tell that his loyalty to the president is something that allows and enables him to craft the MAGA movement in the future without Trump. Vought is another example of this.
I think Stephen Miller also is. Miller didn't start out in life as a Trump guy. I mean, Trump kind of poached him from Jeff Sessions, at that time, the most anti-immigrant kind of senator that he could find. And his entire politics are sort of really an anti-immigrant politics and a kind of a white nationalist politics, right? Before Donald Trump ever entered politics in any serious way, right? That was Stephen Miller's perspective. Now, obviously, he has been extremely loyal and stuck by Trump even during the wilderness years, and established think tanks that sort of promote a right-wing populist perspective on a range of issues, including immigration. And his America First Legal was suing people, government agencies or whatever, on sort of more or less Trumpist or right-wing populist grounds. And, clearly he was betting that Trump or someone like Trump would make their way back into power at some point. So he has been loyal, but really his political perspective is not derived from Donald Trump. And so I think J.D. Vance might be slightly different. I mean, it's hard to say with him how much of his politics is sheer opportunism, and to the extent that it's sincere, how much of it comes from, say, Peter Thiel, and how much of it was awakened by Trump. I mean, that's his story, right? That he just changed his mind and came to his politics by that sort of anti-Trump sort of route. I don't know. It's hard to say. At some point, if he doesn't already, Vance might feel like Trump is just actually kind of getting in the way of what they would really like to do. When Trump's not around, there are people who will be hoping that they can pursue their own political vision in a way that is no longer restrained by Trump or no longer subject to Trump's approval, right? And therefore they can pursue a purer form of that politics. I mean, I guess I put Vance in that category. Miller's said some interesting things. He said something like, this is the only chance we're going to get to do these kind of mass deportations. So I wonder if he actually sees a time limit, a shelf life on this stuff.
Let me ask you on that particular point. So there have been some really alarming reports about the movement, broadly defined, kind of ramping up into an accelerationist version of itself. It knows that the next electoral window can bring the opposition into power, which can lead to Trump's movement getting less of what it wants. So it's ramping up the need to radically reshape American government and society now, while it has the most favorable conditions it might get for a while, if ever. Is that sentiment, that urgency, one that you saw in a lot of speeches?
I feel like I saw a little more triumphalism at the conference, like we won and here's what we're going to do and this is what things are going to be like in the future. I mean, they're very confident, but it's a very mercurial movement, right? So from one week to the next, the mood can shift depending on events and depending on whether they encounter any adversity.
Axios reported that Vaught in his speech said, "Don't think that the minute the president is out of office, this town will not try to pivot back to the form of conservatism that I believe National Conservatism is a response to." And Axios's gloss on this was that there was a palpable urgency on display at the conference, which reflects a movement that knows its window is short.
There's an urgency. I mean, the other thing that's recently been a focus of enormous attention on the right and the far right is the alleged murder of Irina Zarutska, who's a Ukrainian immigrant, and she was apparently randomly stabbed to death. A horrible situation by a 34-year-old black guy who allegedly was fair jumping at the time of the killing and, seemingly attacked this person unprovoked. That has been obsessively discussed. And the urgency there, for example, is they really want to reorient law enforcement around their understanding of race and crime. And so they want law enforcement to racially profile people, proceed on the assumption that Black Americans are more genetically predisposed to crime than white Americans are. They get into eugenics pretty quickly in this discussion. So they will seize on something like that, or this assassination of Charlie Kirk. The urgency is wanting to remake American institutions as quickly as possible along the lines of their prejudices, their narratives, their racist or politically eliminationist kind of view of the world, their sense that Black people are inherently or genetically predisposed to crime. And so instead of social programs to lift people out of poverty, we should just be orienting most of our policing resources to cracking down on Black people, right? And they use an incident like this to kind of try and push things in that direction. And, speaking of Harmeet Dillon, she reposted a post about the Irina Zarutska incident on X saying that this is a civil rights issue. I mean, it's a criminal issue.
Yeah, from Matt Walsh. How does she know already from her office? So this is supposed to be her speaking for her institutional perch. How does she know that this isn't a mental health issue or something else? How is she already declaring it a civil rights issue?
Exactly.
Because they're ready to pounce on anything that could help them implement the heavy-handed measures in remaking society as they want to, as you noted.
Yeah. This speaks to an urgency, right? The urgency is getting cops to embrace the idea that really what they should be doing is cracking down on Black people, getting the FBI to embrace the idea that the most serious danger and the biggest source of violence and terrorism in America is the Democratic Party is literally what some of them are saying.
We saw Tulsi Gabbard there at the conference, Trump's director of national intelligence, who recently gave a conference basically, and I'm not exaggerating, she basically accused former President Barack Obama of instituting a treasonous coup on the American government. That's wild. And yet in the current news cycle, there's about 100 items per day that in any other era would have dominated an entire week's worth of television and print coverage, but today come and go without much incident. Gabbard does that, and it's barely something that people are talking about, right? Because there's so many things coming out of this administration.
I mean, I find her a very puzzling figure because I don't think she's a committed Trump enthusiast. I mean, I get RFK, right? Like he's actually getting to do stuff, but she seems to be in a position where she can only get into trouble. So her remarks, she talked a lot about the deep state, this kind of ongoing supposed live conspiracy inside the American government against Trump. She really thinks that there is a sort of a hidden power with mysterious motivations inside the American government. I think that she has always been kind of, suspicious of who or what is orchestrating U.S. foreign policy. And she came from that kind of politically ambiguous anti-war movement that came to prominence during the War on Terror, which, sure, it included a lot of liberal Democrats, but it also kind of included Ron Paul and I think people got a little bit confused by that. And Tulsi sort of comes out of that kind of history and that formation, right? And she's still saying the same stuff, really. And she's saying that somehow U.S. foreign policy is still directed by, deep state propaganda, and somehow the deep state is still frustrating President Trump's desires for foreign policy. I mean, it just doesn't really hold water.
There were multiple reports that the conference had seriously lackluster attendance. What did you make of the energy at the conference? My take is that something like National Conservatism and its attendant conferences, it works really well as an outsidery phenomenon. But the moment your movement is ascendant or on top, your function, which for the longest time was as a critique of the deep state or the Washingtonian establishment or on the status quo or liberals and Democrats, can no longer draw the same energy when it's your team that is ensconced in power. Is that possibly a reason why it didn't draw the same kind of energy? What do you make of all that?
Well, a lot of what drew people to the banner during the Biden years was that kind of oppositional energy, often based on false ideas. Like, I don't think anyone on the right remembers most of the COVID restrictions, for example, were initially implemented under Trump. And that Trump drove the development of vaccines. They benefited from that kind of oppositional energy throughout the Biden years, and that's kind of disappeared. And the reason I think they seize on crimes like in the way that they do is as a way of resuscitating the idea that there are these shadowy, dark, powerful forces arrayed against them, right? When actually Trump is rapidly turning the entire federal government into an instrument of his will.
The movement seems to need, even when it's in power and it has all the levers of power of government, discuss itself and its role as almost like an insurgency against dark, shadowy forces that are still extant, or at least that we're doing a lot of damage to the American public and to society that now need to be punished. For example, there's a lot of energy coming out still about going after Fauci. So you mentioned how the COVID policies were implemented by Trump. It fell within the purview of his presidency. They find a convenient way to inoculate Trump from it by going after others whom Trump maybe was bamboozled by, quote unquote, or misled by. And
yeah, I mean, another example is the terribly confused and incoherent sort of way that they're dealing with the Epstein stuff, right? Because the other part of this is the whole thing runs on conspiracy theories, and it's kind of hard to sustain conspiracy theories when your guy is in charge of everything. And it's sort of like hard to keep running the Epstein conspiracy theory when clearly Donald Trump was one of his best friends and knew everything that he was up to. I mean, look at poor old Dan Bongino, right? And Kash Patel, like they were railing against the FBI's supposed perfidy in concealing all this stuff. And now they're the guys concealing it.
Thank you for listening to Zooming In, a project of the UnPopulist. To get all of the updates from our new series, Executive Watch, make sure to subscribe for free at theunpopulist.net. Until next time.